So we start off day 2 of the conference with the morning keynote, Jeff Bussgang. Jeff truly embodies an intentional mindset with his professional as well as civic endeavors. Jeff is faculty at Harvard Business School, as well as a co-founder and general partner at Flybridge Capital Partners, an early-stage venture capital firm with over $1 billion under management and offices in New York City and Boston. At Harvard Business School, he teaches launching technology ventures and venture capital journey for aspiring venture capitalists, as well as scaling minority businesses. Jeff is the author of 2 books, Entering Startup Land for startup joiners and Mastering the VC Game for founders, as well as over 50 Harvard Business School case studies on startups and online course launching tech ventures. And Jeff's civic work includes serving as co-founder and board chair of Hack.Diversity, a workforce development program to help Black and Latinx professionals gain access to the innovation economy. He's also the board member at Facing History and Ourselves, an educational nonprofit. Who would be better and a more perfect keynote speaker to start off our day 2 of the TiECon East 2023? Jeff?
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Sunita. I really appreciate it. It's very fun for me to be here with Ty and in the Waltham Westin, where I've spent many breakfast meetings with entrepreneurs over the years. What I thought I would do, because of the subject and theme for Ty, is I thought I would just throw out a couple questions to the audience. I'm an instructor and a professor at HBS, as noted, so I can't help but ask my class a little bit. And I guess what I want to begin with is the following quote: "The social responsibility of business is to increase its profits." Period. Who wrote that? It's the title of a very famous article. The social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. Does anyone know who wrote that? Milton Friedman, University of Chicago economist, Nobel Prize winner, 1970, New York Times editorial. The purpose of business is profits. At the time, Friedman was writing this to say managers of firms shouldn't act in their own individual interests. They should act in shareholder interests. And when I was a student at Harvard Business School, there was this notion of agency theory, which some of you may also know about, which is this idea that the CEO of a company is an agent for the shareholders. And the CEO of a company, therefore, should act solely in the interests of shareholders, and shareholders are not individuals. Individuals can do whatever they want from a societal standpoint. Managers should simply make money and increase shareholder value. How many of you believe in that doctrine today, out of curiosity? Raise your hand if you think that represents your thinking of capitalism. Don't be shy. There's no harm, there's no shame. Okay, so maybe 5% of you. 20 years ago, 90% of Thai Boston, I predict, would have answered and raised their hand. A few years ago, Larry Fink, who, as some of you may know, is the founder and CEO of BlackRock, the largest asset manager in the world, many trillions of dollars of assets under management. Many of you may have some of your holdings in BlackRock funds. Wrote in his annual letter to shareholders that he does annually that stakeholder capitalism is the watchword of our moment and our time. And more recently, because he was criticized for that, he wrote in this most recent letter that in part defending his belief in shareholder capitalism. He says, "Our conviction is that companies perform better when they are deliberate about their role in society and act in the interests of their employees, customers, communities, and their shareholders." That is known as the stakeholder capitalism doctrine. How many of you believe in that as a reflection of capitalism? Okay. The world has flipped in the last 20 years on that point. Why is that relevant for an entrepreneur? Sounds really interesting intellectually in theory, but if you're an entrepreneur, why does that matter? What's striking to me is that at this moment in time, the world has gotten a lot more complicated for entrepreneurs. Because entrepreneurs, when I began as an entrepreneur, I could just simply focus on creating value, equity value, shareholder capitalism. It was really straightforward. But for an entrepreneur, it's one thing for Unilever to worry about sustainability and net zero. What does an entrepreneur do when faced with those kinds of choices? Do they have to worry about those issues when they're in the early journey searching for product market fit, when they're struggling to raise capital, as many entrepreneurs do, and in this environment more than ever? Take DEI as one example. When many of you start your companies, you attract as your first employees who? The people you know, the people you've worked with before. You go to your circle. That naturally creates homogeneity. And that's a common pattern of startups. I did that when I was a founder. I was an early executive in a venture-backed company called Open Market in the mid-1990s. We went public in 1996. Back in the day, this is now pre-bubble, we had $1 billion market cap on $2 million of trailing revenue. 1.8 million to be precise. And at that time, after a 5-year journey, we built a real company, 100 million of revenue, 2 billion market cap. And then I left to start a company called You Promise. First thing I did is I called my former colleagues from Open Market and I said, hey, I'm starting this new company. Come join me. And I picked the handful of people who I thought would be the best people to start this new company with me. All of them were relatively homogeneous, just because that was the pattern. And so founders today are following into that pattern. So now this question of DEI is brought forward, and founders are asked this question: will you have a diverse workforce in the early days? Will you hire an engineering team that is half men, half women? Will you have Black or Latinx employees on your staff? How do you do that in the first 10 employees, the first 20 employees? Again, it's different when you're a big company and you have an HR department and a VP of talent and a director of DEI. That makes it easier. When you're a founder, is this something you should worry about? I didn't think about that candidly as a founder 20 years ago. Founders today are thinking about that very profoundly. And one of the reasons they're thinking about that question is that if they don't hire a diverse workforce, future employees, prospective employees from Gen Z and from millennials, they don't want to work for a homogeneous company. And so recruiting the best talent suddenly becomes very difficult when you try to scale. And this is a conversation I would have with CEOs in the tech sector over the last few years as part of my founding of Hack Diversity, which, as Sunita said, is this program that I co-founded that brings Black and Latinx engineers into the innovation sector. And over 7 years, we've now brought 500 Black and brown engineers in Massachusetts into the innovation sector at companies like HubSpot, Rapid7, and others. And this conversation I would have with CEOs is I would say, you have two problems. This isn't a charity conversation. This is a strategy conversation. You don't have enough tech talent, and your talent isn't diverse enough, and that looks bad when you go to recruit the next generation of talent. They don't want to come into a company that's homogeneous. So that's DEI. Let's talk about the environment, which you're going to have dialogue about later today. Should a founder worry about being carbon neutral? Is the environment and sustainability something that founders need to have on their mind in their first 10, 20 employees? I mean, software companies have a very low carbon footprint. Arguably, that wouldn't be an issue. But many members of the workforce want to know that their employers are exacting policies that they agree with and that their values agree with. And so suddenly now many founders are feeling like they have to buy carbon offsets every time they fly to the West Coast to raise money. Or if they're doing something that has some engineering component or a hardware component, they have to think very carefully about sustainable ingredients or components. Third issue, AI. You knew that we wouldn't get past 10 minutes in this conversation without my saying something about AI. Microsoft has a tremendous lead due to their relationship with OpenAI, the maker of ChatGPT, and as some of you have seen, even though they fumbled that a little bit with their launch of Bing and trying to incorporate the ChatGPT functionality, Microsoft is way ahead. We did a case at Harvard Business School on Microsoft and AI. Our topic was responsible AI. Microsoft has built a very large central organization that is solely dedicated to ensuring that each of the product teams is using and deploying AI techniques in a responsible and ethical fashion. This is something that all the way to the top has been an incredible focus for the organization. They've invested a lot of money, and one of the things they've done, instead of the move fast and break things culture that we've seen others take, like Facebook, Microsoft has said, we're going to slow things down. We're going to go more deliberately in order to make sure that we have deployed AI in a responsible and ethical fashion so that we don't have biases inherent in our system, so that we don't have unintended consequences when we deploy these platforms. Entrepreneurs in this world, in this environment, all of you are going to be deploying AI. Do you have to worry about responsible AI? Do you have to put systems in place and processes in place to make sure that you're using AI responsibly, that the tools that you might be pulling from the cloud and the components are adhering to certain standards? As many of you know, the EU has recently proposed a law regarding AI use and ethics. That law is quite likely to become the law of the land, and much like GDPR, the privacy law that the EU pioneered, it's going to ripple here into the US. You as a founder, you need to start worrying about those things. So although this question of shareholder capitalism versus stakeholder capitalism feels like an intellectual exercise and a fascinating switch in how you all, like many in our society, are switching, and this is a group of business people, by the way. Like, you all are capitalists. Imagine if I had done this with a group of Gen Zers who are not capitalists, which are many of your children, by the way. Many of my friends are complaining that their children are socialists, and it's really killing them. So if you think about this issue, these sets of issues, it's really getting very complicated for entrepreneurs, that they have to worry about these questions of DEI early on in their product market fit journey, that they have to worry about these issues of climate change, even if they're a software company, and being carbon neutral and having a set of values that's consistent with the values of the company they want to create and the employees they want to attract. And then even in this issue of AI, which we all think is this amazing tool that's going to accelerate our business, but has these unintended consequences and downsides and concerns that are forcing some of us, really many entrepreneurs, to slow down. So it's really hard to be an entrepreneur today. Now in 2021, when capital was free, it was a bit easier. Now in 2023, and I don't believe we're ever going to go back to that moment. I don't know what your panel said yesterday afternoon, but as a venture capitalist day-to-day, looking at the market, evaluating opportunities, talking to my colleagues and peers in the industry, that world is gone. Just like the world of 1996 and 1997, when you could take a company public with 1.8 million of trailing revenue, was gone for a long time. That world of 2021 is gone. And today in the new normal, it's even harder for entrepreneurs. All the issues I just discussed, all the tensions, in addition to the fact that the capital markets are more difficult and the bar is higher than ever. So I wish I had an answer for these difficult questions. One of you earlier came up to me and said, when you've heard me speak before, I always ask some thought-provoking questions. I don't have any answers. If you came here for answers, you came to the wrong talk. I apologize deeply. I have questions. I have questions for myself and for my firm in terms of what we're prioritizing. Do we think about impact, or do we just focus on money returns, which is sort of what our LPs care about? But every now and then we talk about impact because some of our LPs are asking us those questions. When I invest in companies, do we think about some of these issues early in the cycle, or do we wait until we have product market fit? Do we wait till we're 50 people, 100 people, closer to profitability, and then we invest in these issues? And to my students, many of whom are wrestling with these questions, I don't know what advice to give them other than to frame the questions and to try to think about what feels right for them in their particular context and their particular industry. So I wanted to lay that out there as a bit of backdrop to challenge this group. Maybe you have the answers. And I want to open it up to Q&A, maybe some A and Q, because I'm hoping that you will share with me and with this group some of the approaches you're taking with your company as you wrestle with these issues yourself. So with that, let me open it up to questions, and I'm happy to pass on the mic and share it. Thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you. Let's hear some questions from Madam President. Anu.
Hold on.
By the way, Anu was kind enough to join me in my HBS classroom. I did a case on supplier diversity, which was a fascinating conversation about a program that the Boston Chamber of Commerce created called the Pacesetters Program, which is trying to help achieve greater supplier diversity. If you look at many top Fortune 500 companies, never mind the city of Boston, the state of Massachusetts, less than 1% of dollars go to black and brown entrepreneurs, which is really extraordinary. And in her role at supply chain at Bank of America, Anu has been a leader in that field. So anyway.
Great, thank you, and I love participating in your class. So my question is, I've heard this number being thrown out there that over 50% of companies are started by women, but only 2% receive VC funding. That number is not improving. If anything, I think for Boston this year, it actually went down. So contrary to what Milton Friedman might say, it feels like we need some policy change or the government to actually intervene here and make that either a law or whatever the right instrument is for that. Because otherwise, this is not going to change. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, first I'll give you the data. So indeed, 2% of all startups that receive venture backing and 2% of the dollars are women-only founders. If you say joint teams, women and male co-founders, it increases to about 15%. But it's still dismal. And if you look at black founders, it's also 1 or 2%. Latinx founders, 1 or 2%. Black women founders, it rounds to 0%. It's like 0.4. I had one of my students who's a black female founder who said she literally like gasped out loud when she saw that data, that her chart in her sector was 0. There's a market failure here, as you note. So now the question is, well, how do you deal with a market failure? And in the world of climate, market failures are a result of externalities, right? So a polluter doesn't face the consequences of pollution. They can spread those consequences to society. And so there's an externality, and you can measure that externality, and then you can create systems to account for that externality. Here it's very difficult to judge and measure the externality and the impact. And I think it's also very difficult for government to know what to do. There have been some proposals, and there's a local entrepreneur here who has one idea, which is to change the carried interest tax structure and to have the carried interest tax, which is the fact that, and Warren Buffett talks about the fact that his secretary has a higher tax rate than he does, that on capital gains, that venture capitalists and private equity folks are taxed in their carried interest on capital gains, not ordinary income, which is much lower, and to apply that differently and discriminately based on the entrepreneur. There are all sorts of ideas being kicked around. I actually don't think a policy solution makes sense here. I think it's more, get more check writers to be more capital in the hands of women and black and Latinx check writers. And so, you know, one of the questions you should ask yourself is how much of your net worth is being managed by female managers? How much of your net worth is being managed by managers of color? And you know, look up the mutual fund managers, look up the banks that you do business with. You know, who owns those banks and how much of your personal wealth is being allocated in areas that fit your values. I think when capitalism and consumers shift, as we have seen happen in terms of green consumerism, when that shift occurs, you're going to see the sea change. And what I have said, we started a fund just for female founders called X Factor Ventures about 7 or 8 years ago, and that's been an incredibly high-performing fund for us. And the reason it's been so high-performing, we believe, is because when you have a market failure, you have opportunity. So capitalists should look for opportunity, and venture capitalists should look for opportunities that are sort of contrarian. You know, this is the view of hedge fund manager Howard Marks that the best investments are when you're contrarian and right. If you're consensus and right, everybody knows. So stop investing in MIT engineers who are, fit a certain pattern. Begin investing in women of color who don't fit a certain pattern. You're going to be more contrarian and you're going to do better. And that's what we've seen in our investment practice. So again, I think it's too hard for government to solve that issue. I think it's more capitalists need to solve that issue. Capitalism needs to solve that issue. And all of you as capitalists have your part in doing that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff, for the pointers. I'm Raj Simon, Chief Product and Technology Officer of a climate tech startup called Tram Global. The question, and I'll also try and answer one of the things that you asked as well. So the question is, increasingly we are seeing adoption of gig platforms in the tech sector, right? The gig economy is starting to expand. And with all the moonlighting and quiet quitting that is going on, do you think startups are at this point of time, in your view, ready to accept gig workers and then kind of build the team around?
When you're in the 0 to 1 phase of a startup, I think it's very hard to outsource your engineering. You are in the middle of customer discovery, trying to learn requirements, trying to get insights, working your way through the idea maze, and I think the best way to do that is to have an integrated product and engineering team. Over time, I think you can do more outsourcing, and certainly as the gig economy and offshoring has swept through the IT industry, you're seeing that. But I have a bias, and my firm has a bias, that in that 0 to 1 phase, you really need to have the founding team, and this is a throwback even in the COVID era and remote work era, the founding team together physically, as close to the customer as possible and as deeply understanding the insights that the customer discovery journey surfaces.
Great. And in terms of the DEI, we are fortunate to have had the three co-founders one from Latin America, Ecuador, one from origin from China and one from the US, and I joined as employee number 1 with background from India. So what we found was that had a profound impact when we go to recruit the talent, because they see that you already have a global representation. And even when we had 10, 20, now 30 people, we by far have the largest diversity. I've served in the corporate sector for 25 years. It's extremely difficult. So I think even your first 1 or 2 recruits that you do, if you have the opportunity to recruit with diversity, I think that goes a long way to help recruit. That's my 10 cents.
That's a great answer and a great case study. One of the things some of my brethren and sisters in the venture capital industry are doing is putting in term sheets, even at the seed or Series A stage, that you will submit, in addition to your quarterly financials, a diversity plan to the board in the first, on an annual basis, which is an interesting way of forcing that sense of accountability in the early days. Yeah.
Hey, I'm Sundi Natarajan from Thai DC. So going back to your Q&A, I think I have a partial answer to what you asked, Anu. So from the world of government contracting, what I've seen in the last few years, and again, that's the world where you don't really need capital to grow your business. You actually go win clients, make revenues. That's another way of growing.